The morning sun painted golden streaks across the forest floor as 16-year-old Maya Chen grabbed her twin brother's hand. Jake's fingers trembled in hers, still cold from the night they had spent hiding in an old barn. Their clothes were dirty and torn from climbing through barbed wire fences, and their stomachs growled with hunger they had learned to ignore. "We can't go back," Maya whispered, her dark eyes scanning the tree line ahead. "You know what he'll do to us." Jake nodded, his usually cheerful face now marked with bruises that told a story neither twin wanted to remember. Their stepfather, Richard Volkov, had moved into their mother's house 6 months ago. At first he seemed kind enough, bringing gifts and promising to take care of their family. But kindness was just a mask he wore in public. Behind closed doors, Richard showed his true nature. The twins had endured months of his violent temper, his drinking binges, and his cruel punishments for the smallest mistakes. Their mother, Sarah, had tried to protect them, but Richard's threats extended to her as well. When Maya discovered the extent of Richard's abuse toward their mother, she knew they had to act. The decision to run came after Richard had locked Jake in the basement for 2 days without food, claiming the boy had been disrespectful. Maya had managed to sneak him water and crackers, but seeing her brother's hollow eyes and hearing his quiet sobs had been the final straw. "Mom will understand," Maya said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "We left her the note. She'll know we had to go." The twins had planned their escape carefully. Maya had been saving money from her part-time job at the local grocery store, hiding bills inside her textbook covers where Richard would never think to look. Jake had mapped out the safest route through the woods, away from the main roads where Richard would search first. They walked deeper into the forest, following a narrow deer path that wound between towering pine trees. The woods belonged to the Blackwood estate, a massive property owned by a wealthy family who lived in the city. According to local stories, the family rarely visited, leaving their thousands of acres of wilderness largely untouched. "Look," Jake said, pointing to a small wooden cabin nestled between 2 large oak trees. "Maybe we can rest there for a while." The cabin appeared abandoned, with overgrown vines covering its walls and windows thick with dust. Maya approached cautiously, testing the door handle. It turned easily, and they stepped inside to find a simple one-room space with an old stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a narrow bed covered in moth-eaten blankets. "This could work," Maya said, examining the cabin's sturdy construction. "At least until we figure out our next move." Jake collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "How long before he starts looking for us?" "He probably already has," Maya replied, checking the cabin's single window. "But Richard doesn't know these woods like we do. Remember all those camping trips Dad took us on before he died?" Their father, David Chen, had been an outdoor enthusiast who taught his children to read nature's signs, to find north without a compass, and to identify edible plants. Those skills, learned during happier times, now meant the difference between survival and capture. Maya began organizing their meager supplies. They had managed to pack 2 backpacks with clothes, a first aid kit, matches, and some non-perishable food. Jake had also brought his father's old hunting knife, a decision that had sparked an argument between the twins. "We're not fighters," Maya had said when she discovered the weapon. "Maybe we need to be," Jake had replied, his jaw set with determination that reminded Maya of their father. As the day wore on, the twins settled into the cabin, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. Maya found an old well behind the cabin that still produced clean water, and Jake discovered a small garden where wild vegetables had taken root among the weeds. "We could actually survive here for a while," Jake said as they shared a dinner of canned beans and wild berries. "If we're careful." Maya wanted to share his optimism, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Richard wasn't the type of man who would simply let them disappear. He was possessive and controlling, and losing his victims would be seen as a personal failure. As darkness fell, the twins heard the distant sound of voices calling their names. Maya peered through the dusty window and saw flashlight beams cutting through the trees several hundred yards away. "They found our trail," she whispered to Jake, who immediately began gathering their belongings. "There's a back window," he said quietly. "We can slip out and head deeper into the woods." But as they prepared to flee, a new voice joined the search party. This voice was different, deeper, older, and speaking with authority that made the other searchers fall silent. "Those kids won't survive a night out here," the voice said. "These woods are dangerous after dark." Maya pressed closer to the window and saw a tall figure in camouflage clothing holding a high-powered rifle. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with a graying beard and the confident posture of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "That's Thomas Brennan," Jake whispered, recognizing the man from town. "He guides hunting trips for city people. They say he knows every inch of these woods." Thomas Brennan had a reputation in their small town of Cedar Falls. Some people called him a skilled outdoorsman and an honest guide. Others whispered darker stories about his military background and his tendency to handle problems with violence rather than words. What everyone agreed on was that Thomas knew the Blackwood estate better than anyone alive. "We need to move now," Maya said. But as they turned toward the back window, they heard footsteps on the cabin's front porch. "I know you're in there," Richard's voice cut through the night air. "This little game is over. You're coming home, and there will be consequences for this behavior." Maya felt Jake tense beside her. They both knew what Richard's consequences looked like. More bruises, longer periods locked in their rooms, and increased surveillance that would make any future escape attempts impossible. "We won't go back," Maya said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "You don't have a choice," Richard replied. "I'm your guardian, and you're minors. Running away is illegal, and harboring runaway children is a crime. Ask Mr. Brennan here." Through the window, Maya could see Thomas Brennan studying the cabin with professional interest. His rifle was held casually, but she noticed how his finger rested near the trigger guard. "Kids," Thomas called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin cabin walls. "This isn't the way to solve your problems. These woods aren't safe at night, and you don't have the experience to survive out here long term." "We're not going back," Jake said, finding his own courage. "He can't make us." Richard's laughter was cold and bitter. "I can, and I will. Thomas here has agreed to help track you down. He knows every hiding spot, every trail, every cave in these woods. You can come out now, or we can wait until you get hungry enough to surrender." Maya looked at their dwindling supplies and realized Richard was right. They had food for maybe 3 days, and winter was approaching fast. But the thought of returning to that house, to those locked rooms and Richard's violent temper, made her stomach twist with fear. "What if we keep running?" she whispered to Jake. "Where would we go? We don't have money for bus tickets, and every adult in town knows Richard. They'd just send us back." Outside, they could hear Richard and Thomas discussing strategy. Richard wanted to storm the cabin immediately, but Thomas advocated for a more patient approach. "Let them think about their situation overnight," Thomas suggested. "By morning, they'll be cold, hungry, and ready to be reasonable." "I want this finished tonight," Richard insisted. "Every hour they're gone makes them more defiant." Maya realized this was their chance. While the two men argued, she and Jake could slip out the back window and disappear deeper into the woods. It was risky, but staying meant certain capture. They gathered their backpacks and moved toward the rear of the cabin. Jake carefully opened the back window, wincing at the slight creaking sound. Maya went first, dropping silently onto the soft earth below, then helped her brother climb out. The voices from the front of the cabin continued, but now they could hear more footsteps. Richard had brought additional searchers, probably volunteers from town who believed they were helping find two lost children. Moving as quietly as possible, the twins crept away from the cabin, using the shadows of large trees to hide their movement. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when they heard Richard's angry shout. "The cabin's empty! They got away!" Immediately, flashlight beams began sweeping the forest around them. Maya grabbed Jake's hand and they began to run, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind them, they could hear Thomas Brennan giving orders to the search party. "Spread out in a line. Check every tree, every bush. They can't have gone far." The twins ran through the dark forest, branches catching at their clothes and roots threatening to trip them with every step. Maya's heart pounded so hard she was sure the searchers could hear it, but adrenaline kept her legs moving. They reached a small stream and splashed through it, hoping the water would mask their scent if Richard had brought tracking dogs. On the far side, they found a dense thicket of blackberry bushes and crawled inside, ignoring the thorns that scratched their arms and faces. For what felt like hours, they lay perfectly still while searchers passed nearby. Several times, flashlight beams swept over their hiding spot, but the thick vegetation concealed them. Gradually, the voices grew more distant as the search party moved to other areas of the forest. "I think they're gone," Jake whispered. Maya was about to reply when they heard a single pair of footsteps approaching their thicket. These steps were different, slower, more deliberate, belonging to someone who knew exactly where he was going. "I know you can hear me," Thomas Brennan's voice said softly. "I've been tracking people in these woods for 30 years. You left a trail a blind man could follow." The footsteps stopped directly in front of their hiding spot. Maya held her breath and pressed herself closer to the ground. "Your stepfather is a hard man," Thomas continued. "I won't pretend otherwise. But these woods will kill you if you stay out here much longer. There are bears, wild boar, and the temperature drops below freezing at night this time of year." Maya felt Jake trembling beside her, but they remained silent. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, and they heard the distinctive sound of a rifle bolt being worked. "You're going to come out of there nice and slow, and we're going to have a conversation about your options." The metallic click of a rifle being readied echoed through the forest, and Maya realized their desperate flight had only delayed the inevitable. Thomas Brennan had found them, and there was nowhere left to run. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the rifle barrel pointed in their general direction. Thomas Brennan stood perfectly still, his weathered face visible in the moonlight that filtered through the forest canopy. There was something in his expression that didn't match the threatening tone of his words, a sadness that Maya couldn't quite understand. "Please," she whispered, slowly raising her hands. "We're not criminals." "No," Thomas said quietly, lowering his rifle slightly. "You're just scared kids who've been pushed too far." Jake remained frozen beside his sister, unable to process the sudden shift in Thomas's demeanor. The man who had been hunting them moments before now seemed almost protective. "Come out of there," Thomas repeated. But this time his voice carried no threat. "We need to talk, and those thorns are cutting you to pieces." Reluctantly, the twins crawled out of the blackberry thicket, their clothes torn and their arms marked with dozens of small scratches. Thomas studied them in the moonlight, taking note of Jake's bruised face and Maya's defensive posture. "How long has Richard been hurting you?" Thomas asked bluntly. Maya and Jake exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Adults had asked them similar questions before: teachers, neighbors, even a police officer who had responded to a noise complaint. But their answers had always made things worse at home. "It's complicated," Maya finally said. Thomas snorted. "Nothing complicated about a grown man hitting children. The question is whether you're willing to do something about it." "Like what?" Jake asked, his voice bitter with disappointment. Every adult in town thinks Richard is wonderful. He donates money to the church, volunteers at the fire department, and acts like the perfect stepfather in public. That's because they don't see what happens behind closed doors, Thomas replied. But I've been watching. The twins stared at him in confusion. Thomas slung his rifle over his shoulder and sat down on a fallen log, motioning for them to join him. I live about 2 miles from your house, he explained. Sound carries on quiet nights, especially angry voices and crying. I've heard enough to know Richard Volkoff isn't the man he pretends to be. Maya felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. Then why are you helping him find us? Because running away isn't the solution, Thomas said firmly. It just makes you look guilty and gives him more ammunition to use against you. What you need is proof of what he's doing. Jake shook his head. We tried that. Maya took pictures of my bruises with her phone. But Richard found them and deleted everything. Then he broke the phone and told everyone Maya had been acting out. Digital evidence is too easy to destroy, Thomas agreed. What you need is something Richard can't touch or manipulate. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. This has been recording our entire conversation. Richard doesn't know I have it. And he certainly doesn't know what he said to me while we were looking for you. Maya leaned forward eagerly. What did he say? Enough to hang himself, Thomas replied grimly. Richard assumed I was just another local he could manipulate. He told me all about his discipline methods and how he was going to make sure you two never tried to run again. The recording device seemed tiny in Thomas's weathered hands, but Maya realized it might represent their salvation. Will anyone believe it? Judge Patricia Williams will, Thomas said. She's been looking for a reason to investigate your household ever since your school counselor filed a report last month. Jake's eyes widened. Mrs. Henderson filed a report? Teachers are mandated reporters, Thomas explained. When they see signs of abuse, they're legally required to contact authorities. The problem is proving abuse when the abuser is careful and manipulative. Thomas stood up and began walking deeper into the forest, motioning for the twins to follow. Richard thinks I'm tracking you down to drag you home. Instead, I'm going to help you disappear long enough for the authorities to act on the evidence we're gathering. Where are we going? Maya asked, struggling to keep up with Thomas's confident stride through the dark woods. Somewhere Richard will never think to look, Thomas replied. I've got a hunting cabin about 5 miles from here. It's completely off the grid. No electricity, no phone service, and definitely not on any maps Richard might have access to. As they walked, Thomas shared more details about his plan. He had been gathering evidence against Richard for weeks, including testimony from other neighbors who had witnessed suspicious behavior. The recording device was just the latest piece of a growing case. Why are you helping us? Jake asked as they climbed over a fallen tree. You don't even know us. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I had a daughter once, he finally said. Jennifer. She was about your age when she died. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. What happened to her? Her stepfather happened, Thomas said, his voice tight with old pain. I was overseas at the time, serving in Afghanistan. Jennifer's mother remarried while I was gone, and by the time I got back, it was too late. The twins walked in silence, processing Thomas's revelation. His military bearing and careful planning suddenly made more sense, as did his determination to help them. Jennifer tried to tell people what was happening, Thomas continued, but her stepfather was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. Nobody believed a troubled teenage girl over an upstanding adult. How did she die? Maya asked gently. Officially? A fall down the stairs, Thomas replied bitterly. Unofficially? Her stepfather pushed her during one of his rages. By the time I could prove it, he had already moved to another state with a new identity. Jake stopped walking. Did you find him? Thomas's smile was cold and predatory. Eventually, but that's a story for another time. They resumed walking, and Maya began to understand the depth of Thomas's commitment to their cause. This wasn't just about helping two runaway kids, it was about preventing another tragedy like the one that had destroyed his family. The hunting cabin appeared suddenly out of the darkness, a small but sturdy structure built into the side of a rocky hill. Thomas produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. "Welcome to your temporary home," he said, lighting an oil lamp that filled the cabin with warm, flickering light. The interior was sparse but comfortable, with two narrow bunk beds, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with canned goods and camping supplies. A small table held maps of the surrounding area, and Maya noticed that several locations were marked with red X's. "Those are Richard's search patterns," Thomas explained, following her gaze. "I've been monitoring his radio communications. He's organized the search into a grid system, but this cabin is in a section he's already marked as clear." Jake examined the maps more closely. "How long do we have to stay here?" 48 hours, maybe 72 at most," Thomas replied. "Judge Williams is fast-tracking the investigation based on the evidence I've provided. By this time Friday, Richard should be in custody." Maya felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since their escape began, she allowed herself to believe they might actually be safe. "What about our mother?" she asked. "Will she be in trouble for not protecting us?" Thomas's expression softened. "Your mother is as much a victim as you are. Sarah's been trying to leave Richard for months, but he's threatened to hurt you kids if she goes to the police. She's been trapped in an impossible situation." The twins spent the next hour learning about Thomas's military background and his work as a hunting guide. He had returned from 3 tours of duty to find his daughter dead and his ex-wife too frightened to seek justice. Since then, he had dedicated his civilian life to protecting children from predators like Richard Volkoff. "I've helped 17 families escape abusive situations," Thomas explained as he prepared hot soup over a small camp stove. "Sometimes through legal channels, sometimes through more creative methods." "Creative methods?" Jake asked. "Let's just say some bullies need to be reminded that they're not the biggest predators in the forest," Thomas replied with a grim smile. As the night wore on, the twins began to relax for the first time in months. Thomas proved to be a skilled storyteller, sharing adventures from his military service and encounters with wildlife during his years as a guide. He carefully avoided graphic details about combat or violence, instead focusing on the bonds formed between soldiers and the beauty of wilderness areas he had visited around the world. "The thing about bullies," Thomas said as they settled down for sleep, "is that they're fundamentally cowards. They pick on people who can't fight back, and they avoid anyone who might pose a real threat." "Richard isn't afraid of anything," Maya said quietly. "He's afraid of losing control," Thomas corrected. "That's why he became so desperate when you ran away. For the first time, his victims acted independently, and that terrifies him more than any physical threat could." Jake had fallen asleep on one of the narrow bunks, exhausted from their ordeal. Maya remained awake, staring at the cabin's rough wooden ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. "Mr. Brennan?" she whispered. "What if this doesn't work? What if Richard gets away with it like Jennifer's stepfather did?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Then we'll try something else," he finally said. "I won't let another child die on my watch." His words carried a weight that made Maya believe him completely. Whatever happened next, she knew they had found an unexpected ally in their fight for freedom. Outside the cabin, the forest was alive with night sounds, owls calling to each other, the distant splash of a beaver in the stream, and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. For the first time in months, these sounds brought comfort instead of fear. Maya was finally drifting off to sleep when she heard a new sound that made her blood run cold. Somewhere in the distance, dogs were barking, and the sound was getting closer. "Mr. Brennan," she whispered urgently, but Thomas was already awake and reaching for his rifle. "Tracking dogs," he said grimly. Richard must have called in favors from the county sheriff's department. The barking grew louder, accompanied by the voices of multiple searchers. Maya could hear Richard's voice rising above the others, directing the search with military precision. "They'll hunt us," Maya whispered, remembering her father's warnings about tracking dogs and their incredible ability to follow a scent trail. Thomas checked his rifle and moved toward the cabin's single window. "Not if I hunt them first," he said quietly, and Maya heard the sound of a bullet being chambered into the rifle. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and Maya realized their temporary sanctuary had become a trap with only one way out. The barking of the tracking dogs echoed through the forest, growing closer with each passing minute. Thomas moved efficiently around the small cabin, extinguishing the oil lamp and gathering essential supplies into a single backpack. "We're leaving," he told the twins quietly. "This cabin was always meant to be temporary. I have one more place they'll never find us." Maya shook Jake awake, and within minutes they were ready to move. Thomas led them out the back of the cabin and up a steep, rocky slope that would be difficult for dogs to follow. The scent trail would be broken by the stone surface, buying them precious time. "Where are we going?" Jake asked as they climbed, his breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. "Sacred ground," Thomas replied cryptically. They climbed for 20 minutes, following what seemed to be an invisible path known only to Thomas. Finally, they reached a plateau where ancient pine trees formed a natural circle around a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered stone monument, barely visible in the moonlight. "This is a Native American burial ground," Thomas explained, setting down his pack. "It's protected by federal law, which means even the county sheriff can't authorize a search here without extensive paperwork and tribal permission." Maya examined the stone monument more closely and realized it was carved with symbols and text in a language she couldn't read. "Will they really respect that?" "Richard might not," Thomas admitted, "but Sheriff Davidson is Cherokee on his mother's side. He won't desecrate sacred ground, even for someone like Richard." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching voices drifted up from below. Flashlight beams swept through the trees at the base of the rocky slope, and they could hear Richard's frustrated commands to the search party. "The trail goes cold at the rocks," a voice called out. "Dogs can't pick up the scent from here." "Then we search every cave, every hollow, every possible hiding place," Richard snapped back. "They're children. They can't have gone far." Thomas motioned for the twins to take cover behind the monument, while he positioned himself where he could observe the search party below. Through the darkness, Maya could see at least 8 people with flashlights, and she spotted 2 German shepherds straining at their leashes. "Mr. Brennan," Sheriff Davidson's voice carried clearly through the still air. "My dogs have lost the trail. If these kids made it up those rocks in the dark, they've got more skill than we gave them credit for." "Keep looking," Richard demanded. "I'm not going home without my children." Maya heard the possessive way Richard said "my children" and felt sick to her stomach. They weren't his children. They were his victims. "Actually, Mr. Volkov," Sheriff Davidson continued, and his tone had changed noticeably. "I need to speak with you about some new information that's come to light." Thomas smiled grimly and pulled out his digital recorder. Maya realized he must have sent the recording to authorities before leading them to the burial ground. "What information?" Richard asked, but there was a new wariness in his voice. "Judge Williams has issued a warrant for your arrest," Sheriff Davidson announced. "You're being charged with child abuse, domestic violence, and making terroristic threats." The forest fell silent, except for the sound of Richard's heavy breathing. Maya held her breath, afraid that any sound might give away their location. "That's ridiculous," Richard finally said, but his confident facade was cracking. "I've never laid a hand on those kids." "This is all a misunderstanding. We have recordings of you describing your discipline methods in detail," Sheriff Davidson replied. "We also have medical records, school reports, and testimony from multiple witnesses." Maya heard the metallic click of handcuffs, followed by Richard's angry protests. "This is a setup. Someone's manipulating the evidence." "You have the right to remain silent," Sheriff Davidson began, and Maya felt tears of relief streaming down her face. The search party began to disperse, their voices growing more distant as they made their way back through the forest. Thomas waited until he was certain they were gone before emerging from his hiding spot. "It's over," he said simply. Jake was crying now, too, months of fear and tension finally being released. Maya put her arms around her brother and held him close while Thomas stood guard, making sure no one had stayed behind to continue the search. "What happens now?" Maya asked when she found her voice again. "Now you get your lives back," Thomas replied. "Judge Williams has already arranged for you to stay with your maternal grandmother in Oregon while the investigation continues. Your mother will join you there once she's finished testifying against Richard." Maya had almost forgotten about Grandma Rose, their mother's mother who lived in a small town outside Portland. They had visited her a few times when their father was still alive, and Maya remembered her as a kind, strong woman who baked incredible cookies and told stories about their family's history. "Mom knew about this plan?" Jake asked. Thomas nodded. "She's been working with authorities for weeks, gathering evidence and preparing to leave Richard safely. Tonight was just the final piece of the puzzle." As dawn began to break through the forest canopy, Thomas led them down a different path that emerged near the main road. A county sheriff's vehicle was waiting for them, but instead of Sheriff Davidson, a woman in civilian clothes stood beside it. "That's Detective Rodriguez," Thomas explained. "She specializes in domestic violence cases. She'll take you somewhere safe while the legal process plays out." Detective Rodriguez proved to be a compassionate woman in her 40s, who had clearly dealt with many similar cases. She spoke to the twins gently, explaining their rights and the support services available to them. "Your mother is safe," she assured them as they drove toward town. "Richard has been taken into custody and he won't be getting bail. The evidence against him is overwhelming." Maya watched the familiar landscape of Cedar Falls pass by the car window and realized she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in months, their hometown looked like a place where they might actually be able to live in peace. At the courthouse, they were reunited with their mother, who looked both relieved and guilty. Sarah Chen hugged her children tightly, apologizing repeatedly for not protecting them sooner. "I was so scared," she admitted through her tears. "Richard threatened to hurt you if I tried to leave. I didn't know what to do." "You did what you had to do to survive," Detective Rodriguez told her. "Abusers are experts at making their victims feel helpless and isolated. What matters is that you found the courage to act when you had the chance." The legal proceedings moved quickly. Richard's recording with Thomas had provided prosecutors with a confession of sorts, and when combined with medical evidence, witness testimony, and financial records showing a pattern of control, the case was ironclad. Richard ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, followed by probation and a permanent restraining order preventing him from contacting the Chen family. 3 months later, Maya stood on the front porch of Grandma Rose's farmhouse, watching Jake help their grandmother feed chickens in the yard. Their mother was inside, making dinner and humming songs she hadn't sung since their father died. Thomas Brennan had become a regular visitor, driving down from Washington every few weeks to check on their progress. He and Grandma Rose had formed an unlikely friendship, bonding over their shared military backgrounds and love of the outdoors. "You saved our lives," Maya told him during one of his visits. Thomas shook his head. "You saved your own lives by having the courage to run." I just helped you find a safe place to land." Maya had started attending therapy to deal with the trauma of their experience, and she was slowly learning to trust adults again. Dr. Sarah Kim, a specialist in childhood trauma, helped her understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault, and that healing would take time. Jake had thrown himself into his new school, joining the track team and making friends who knew nothing about their past. He still had nightmares sometimes, but they were becoming less frequent. Their mother was perhaps the one who had changed the most. Free from Richard's control, Sarah Chen was rediscovering the confident, happy woman she had been before fear consumed her life. She had started taking art classes again and was considering going back to school to finish her nursing degree. "What about your other work?" Maya asked Thomas during one of their conversations. "The other families you help?" Thomas smiled mysteriously. "There's a network of people like me," he explained. "Veterans, retired police officers, social workers, people who understand that sometimes the system needs help protecting those who can't protect themselves." Maya learned that Thomas's organization had helped dozens of families escape abusive situations over the years. They operated quietly, using their skills and connections to gather evidence, provide safe passage, and ensure that predators faced consequences for their actions. "Will you teach me?" Maya asked. "When I'm older, I mean. I want to help other kids like Jake and me." Thomas studied her seriously. "It's dangerous work," he warned, "and it stays with you forever." "So does being helpless," Maya replied. "I never want to feel that powerless again." 6 months after their escape from the forest, Maya received a letter from an unexpected source. Thomas had given her address to other survivors of domestic violence, and now she was corresponding with teenagers across the country who were dealing with similar situations. One letter particularly moved her. It was from a 14-year-old girl named Ashley, whose stepfather was using the same tactics of control and intimidation that Richard had employed. Ashley had read about Maya's case in a news article and was asking for advice. Maya spent hours crafting her response, sharing practical survival tips, but also emphasizing the importance of reaching out to trusted adults and building a support network. She included Detective Rodriguez's contact information and resources for domestic violence hotlines. "You're not alone," she wrote. "There are people who will believe you and help you. Don't give up." As the first anniversary of their escape approached, Maya realized how much their lives had changed. Jake was thriving in his new environment. Their mother was stronger and happier than she had been in years. And Maya herself was discovering a sense of purpose she never knew existed. Thomas visited them one last time before the anniversary, bringing news that Richard had been assaulted in prison by inmates who had learned about his crimes against children. He was in protective custody now, serving out his sentence in isolation. "I can't say I'm sorry to hear it," Sarah Chen admitted quietly. "Justice takes many forms," Thomas replied. "The important thing is that he can't hurt anyone else." On the anniversary night, the family gathered around Grandma Rose's fireplace, sharing stories and memories of their journey from victims to survivors. Maya looked around at the faces of the people she loved, all of them safe and healing, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "They'll hunt us," she had whispered to Jake in those dark woods a year ago. Now she understood that the real hunt had been for justice, dignity, and the right to live without fear. And in the end, they had been the ones doing the hunting. Thomas raised a toast with hot chocolate instead of wine, honoring their courage and the memory of his daughter Jennifer. "To survivors," he said simply, "and to making sure no one has to face their monsters alone." Outside, the wind whispered through the Oregon pines, but it carried no threat now, only the promise of freedom and the knowledge that sometimes, when the darkness seems overwhelming, ordinary people can become heroes simply by refusing to give up hope. Maya Chen fell asleep that night with plans forming in her mind: college applications, internships with advocacy organizations, and a future dedicated to protecting other children who found themselves lost in forests both literal and metaphorical. The hunt was over, but the healing had just begun. And for the first time in her life, Maya was excited to see what tomorrow might bring.